Welcome to the Dallaglio RugbyWorks podcast. Our podcast aims to talk to interesting people. Our themes are always about young people and inclusion, and how we get the excluded young people included. And we talk to a series of people who have an interesting perspective on both where they've got to, how they got there, and how their lives might be intertwined or interacting with young people. And it gives me my absolute great pleasure to welcome this time Ciaran Thapar, who is known as an author, a podcaster, a music critic, a Substack stacker, a producer of a Substack, whatever that might be. But started really his passion for working with young people as a youth worker, and is currently the Director of Marketing and Communications for the Youth Endowment Foundation. So he's going to have an amazing perspective for us. Welcome, Ciaran.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
You are so welcome. I've just given a bit of a background of all of the things that you've done and your now very strategic role. How do you think the journey you have been on has helped you see the system? And also, not just the system, I'm talking about the system for young people, but that journey, what's it shown you about the system? And what sort of things do you think need to change? What needs to happen?
So we're diving straight into the deep end. So I started my journey in this kind of world just over a decade ago as a youth worker, and by youth worker at the time, it kind of was a split role where I was doing lots of different bits. I was doing a formal full-time job for a charity working as an education mentor, but I was also doing lots of voluntary mentoring on the side of that. So I was sort of quite immersed in working with young people in my local community in South London. And it showed me, working both across education and the youth sector, so in schools as well as in several different youth services local to me. That was like the beginning of starting to show me institutionally what was potentially going right and some of the good things that were happening in young people's lives, but also obviously some of the issues that were failing young people. And in particular, I sort of got drawn into the focus of violence affecting children and young people because of a couple of sort of particularly pronounced tragedies that took place within the context of that work within the first 3 or 4 years of me doing it. Some young people that, me working with, them being affected, their families being affected by violence. And I think, so therefore, I was sort of seeing I was working on programs that were having success and in changing young people's lives, and like I felt really like part of teams that were doing that. But I was also becoming frustrated and also privy to a lot of the problems as well across different types of institutions working with young people in that context. So I suppose that's just like important prologue to what everything else has happened since then, and I think it sort of defined the direction of travel for my career. I think a lot of the things that have gone wrong is just a general underinvestment of both financial, like both money and also just like attention and respect. I think one of the big transferable problems that I saw working both across youth services and schools was that there was this particular type of young person who was being failed, and they were being failed across those institutions, but also often when they were in public, they were being stopped and searched, or they were being treated by the police or the law in a particular way. Often in a way that they couldn't control. I think obviously, people have agency and have responsibility for their own actions, but I think often I would be privy to these situations that were really out of the child's control, and also potentially being failed at home as well. So, various family issues going on, cramped housing. So actually, if you really consider how a young person in that situation lives their life, there's nowhere for them to go and feel safe or very few places for them to go. I think that's why I really valued youth work in the end, because I think that youth work can provide that space for that particularly more vulnerable or more challenged young person, where a lot of the other spaces have been removed or underinvested in. So I think that's maybe like a good intro to why I was motivated to sort of get into this in the first place.
Amazing. And I absolutely everything you said resonates with my own experience in working with young people, and actually my own experience of being a young person in the 60s and 70s in London and the late 70s and early 80s in Cornwall. So two very, very urban and a very rural experience. But a lot of what you said resonates with my own experience. What I feel is that there are probably more young people now who are falling through all of the cracks and who the general safety net, for an example, school, mainstream school, is also failing them. And statistically, that's true. We have higher rates of permanent and fixed term exclusions, used to be suspensions, now than we probably ever had. Is there a silver bullet to change this system, or is it much more a series of little things? I absolutely agree with you, by the way, about not the silver bullet, but the catastrophic and dire underinvestment in young people. And I really see that in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, that we have had a catastrophic neglect financially of young people. But if we were to say that's a given, we know that we've lost 70% of youth services due to underfunding. We know that we shut Sure Start hubs, children's centres. We know that. What would be, other than just money, what might be the things that you would see that would be the system changes?
I think that it kind of, zooming out a bit, I think it taps into ideas about community and about interconnectivity between people. Because I think the problem we're focusing on here is one of several quite profound problems and symptoms that are existing across society in different spaces that are not just focused on young people or young people affected by violence. There's also adults feeling more lonely, higher rates of obesity. There's lots of different manifestations of these problems, which I think can be solved by better systems change that serves people feeling more connected to one another. And it's, the irony is that, and that sounds a bit vague, but I suppose what I mean, like, there has been I think alongside the sort of financial divestment, there is a crumbling of a sense of community and a sense of society, and that's been taking place for decades potentially. But I think with technological change, it kind of kids you into thinking that, and it does allow you to feel more connected. You and I are having this conversation over Teams right now, which would not have been possible. And so, these types of communications are really rich because conversation can take place. But I think in terms of supporting someone that is more vulnerable and requires a family around them and a sense of feeling grounded and safe, I don't think that a lot of the services that are now in the way they're organized, let alone funded, are equipped to deal with some of the problems of isolation and disconnectivity between people. Silver bullet, I don't know, but a reorganization systematically of how different services interact with one another, how information is shared, how just on a sort of general level, how people can come together in their local area and be part of something. I think those types of ideas, because I think you would end up then solving other social problems, and that is a reorganization. I think that's it's very challenging. It's very challenging, but I think that's more of a reorganization thing than a funding thing. Obviously, having the funding, if we're assuming that's not available, I think structurally we're unfortunately we've not been set up in a way that now allows people to feel connected and feel supported by people. I often think about this, like the premise of my book Cut Short, which is a story about my youth work journey for the first 5 years. One of the things I say in there, and it still drives me to this day, is I grew up in a middle class home where I felt very safe and I felt very supported. And I feel an obligation to move through life serving my community and serving society. I feel an obligation towards that. I don't think that a lot of people are set up in a way that allows them to do that. And I think if we created opportunities for people to do more meaningful volunteering, to participate something within a few hundred meters of their front door, I think those types of opportunities could be really transformative for society and not cost that much financially.
That's interesting. I mean, there's a lot that you said in there. I'm picking up on some of it. Without doubt, every review into a catastrophic safeguarding failure resulting in the death of a child, the one commonality in those reviews is that nobody talked to each other, that there was poor communication between everybody. And so I think your point about we're just not set up and joined up is incredibly well made. Quite how we solve that, I don't know, because I was very struck by the Victoria Kalimbe report. And what was that, 15, 20 years ago? And we still don't seem to have cracked that one. But I totally agree with you on that point. I think you're right about, young people who are often brought up without the kind of protective factors you had of feeling safe at home, feeling supported, feeling there was enough food to eat. Without that, I think it's very difficult to see how you give back if you weren't ever exposed to that as a child. But I'm really interested in your, I suppose because it's so current, your idea about how community supports community. I was deeply saddened. I was past anger at the Tommy Robinson marches at the weekend. My friends of colour, the people that I know who live in vulnerable, unsafe communities are all feeling considerably less safe than they did before the Wave the Flag sort of campaign came about. And what really strikes me about that is that a lot of people are motivated to get involved because they feel frightened themselves. They don't feel a part of a community. They don't feel connected. They feel as ostracized from where they live. And yet it is one of the most divisive things I've seen. How do you go about solving those entrenched community rifts? How do you get people actually, instead of blaming the 0.00001% of people seeking asylum who have committed a sexual assault, as opposed to the 80% of white straight men who commit the sexual assaults, how do you get to bridge those divides, give those messages, get people to see that their neighbours could be their friends even if they don't look like them? How do you create that community that you're talking about?
I mean, I don't have a really easy, clear answer to that. So I don't want to act like I have a sort of, I think it's really hard, the problem you just outlined. And I think it's so fresh in my mind what happened on the weekend as well. I'm still feeling a bit bamboozled by it. I feel like I personally, as a man and who's someone who's mixed race, I feel triggered and I feel unsafe by what I saw in the Tommy Robinson marches, and I feel personally hurt about what's happening to the country that I've like grown up in and known, and that I have, I found family roots stretching back centuries in. But I also am wary that I was thinking about this today, I could probably walk through that march and I'd find it horrible, but I would probably be I wouldn't be harmed necessarily. I can kind of blend in. My wife can't. My sisters probably can't. I've seen videos of Punjabi women, that just last week there was a Punjabi woman was sexually assaulted by two white men who it was a racially motivated attack in the Midlands. I think about I think about the fact that there's just so many people around me right now who are potentially vulnerable to harms. Some of which I feel, but some of which are just I feel probably don't end up reaching me. And I'm just like, all of this stuff is swirling right now. And I don't know if I have the answer to it, because I think it's so deep rooted, and I think there's such a failure by current political leadership to speak to people in a way that is authentic, that it's almost like that me and you and anyone else who is trying to do work on a more maybe community level or at least charity sector, it feels quite daunting, this whole problem, because of the scale of what they've got wrong in the political class. And maybe that's one answer to your question, is that trying to solve it requires much more profound and active leadership. I think the leadership in this country has been so embarrassing. And the fact that, like, on Saturday, Keir Starmer gave a speech on Sunday that responded to what happened. On Saturday, his Twitter account was churning out robotic tweets about asylum seekers whilst 100,000 people were marching on his capital city. I just think that, like, that reflects the type of political leadership that we're seeing right now. We need more. I'm also parking political leadership. I also, on a more granular community level, kind of going back to what I was saying before, I think those of us that are in a position that have experience doing community work, I think now is the time to step up a bit and be more proactive. Because I've balanced my work as a youth worker and writer, I've often taken the position that, and I have for the last few years certainly, that my ability to make change is trying to sort of do my job well and keep writing. But this weekend has made me think about, I need to, like, step outside and be more vocal and be more proactive again on the ground, because I think it's quite urgent now. So I don't have a clear answer for you, but those are just some reflections about what I've been thinking about the last few days. I'm genuinely still quite confused about what's happening. It's very, very confusing and overwhelming. So sort of solution wise, I don't have a clear one, but those are some thoughts.
I completely empathise. I am with what you're saying, not with you and your personal situation, but with what you're saying, because I'm very overwhelmed by it. I'm very horrified by it. I'm incredibly upset by it, and I'm also incredibly self-critical, because I have never stepped into the political arena. It's never been something I have wanted to do, and yet I am genuinely revolted by what I see in the political arena. And whether that's coming from a crushing disappointment about elected political leaders who I feel are just saying nothing, or what they're saying is so vanilla it's almost pointless, or whether it's by political leaders that I see as saying things that I find utterly hateful. And yet I have never stood as a political leader on a local level or on a national level. Now, that's partly because I don't like party politics, and because I don't personally fit in well to that level of compromise. It's probably, Ciaran, why I'm single, because I don't fit in well to any level of compromise. But more seriously, I think I too have to find a voice again that perhaps I haven't had for quite a long time, because I can't be quiet when I know that my friends and family are scared to go shopping. Yeah. I can't be quiet when I know that some of the people who are joining those marches or are coming out on social media are doing it based on factual inaccuracies that border on deliberate lies. They are entitled to their view. They don't have to like immigration, but they can't base their dislike of immigration on a pack of lies.
Yeah.
On a pack of lies about cost, on a pack of lies about housing, on a pack of lies about safety to women and girls. They can't base their opinion on that. They're entitled to their opinion, but it can't be based on lies. And I think that we have to find a better way of articulating that, because I think one of the things that the people who are galvanising behind this flag waving movement, and by the way, British values are about inclusivity, diversity, trust, respect, tolerance. I don't see much of that with the flag waving. But what I do think is that the counter argument tends to be incredibly wordy, incredibly intellectual, incredibly long. And I think that there's something that really resonates with what you said earlier, is about finding that authentic voice that is clear and of the people. And we are of the people, and I can speak with a voice that can be quite clear and concise. I wouldn't believe it with what I've just said, but trust me, I can. And I think it's about finding a way to challenge the lies if we do nothing else.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking about this when there were various, obviously, analyses that came out of, the weekend in March. One of them was, I remember hearing a clip of this journalist asking someone who was marching why they're there, and the person said, because this country's turning into North Korea. And the journalist was like, well, you wouldn't be able to march like this in North Korea. And it's just like that, for me, speaks to how disconnected this whole thing is. It's like people are feeling, rightfully, I think, that the country has been the country's struggling. I think economically the country's struggling. We've talked about how it's been poorly invested in. We've also talked about how a breakdown of community, sort of in terms of how society has been ran, has happened. There are also, global issues at play that we are not separate from. Britain has waded into global issues for hundreds of years, and there are certain responsibilities we now have to just face up to that fact. There are wars happening all across the Middle East. There are like borders that are drawn across Africa, across Asia by white men 100, 150 years ago. And a lot of the conflicts and tensions that are now causing people to move to Europe or try to seek refuge in Europe come from a lot of these decisions. And that doesn't mean that we just have to save everyone. But I think that there has to be a serious engagement with the fact that a lot of people arriving in this country are doing so because they're trying to, save their lives and save their families' lives. And meeting that with a bit of understanding and compassion, it has to be the first place. Part of the problem here, this is obviously getting into sort of other territory, but it's front and center of my mind as I prepare to write my next book, is the problem with our understanding of a national story. A lot of people's understanding of our history and our national story is one that tells them that we are a kind of exceptional white only country that has a very narrow set of values that I don't actually subscribe to as a British person, and actually my white British family, I would say, don't subscribe to at all. And I think that the worst ends of those values are being exploited for marches like this over the weekend, and people's the failure to tell a national story, to tell one that's uplifting, alongside the failure to invest financially, I think is causing havoc now. And you've got people like Tommy Robinson, who is actually able to stand up and speak with, part of the problem with Tommy Robinson now is he's kind of it echoes what's happening, what's happening in America, where it's almost like a monster that you throw things at and it gets stronger. Because if you try and lock up Tommy Robinson, it just allows him to tell the masses that the system that they don't like is against him. So I think we're in a really difficult position to be able to challenge someone like him, actually. And that's why, going back to my original point, and then I'll stop here, that's why the lack of leadership, I think, is such a clear problem. Because I don't think politics is going to solve all of this stuff. I think actually the political system is quite limited. I think it has an important role to play, but it can be quite limited. But within that important role to play, I think, is a sense of leadership, looking at a politician who is leading and being oh, this person, even if I don't agree with them, this person means what they say and they care. Not robotic, as you say, that the vanilla statements that basically can mean nothing. If you're someone that is really disenfranchised and you hear that stuff, I do get it emotionally why you're going to try and march, especially if someone is speaking your language and speaking to your anger and your pain. So I get it emotionally, and I think I have empathy for people that are trying to look for answers. But yeah, I think I'm really energized. I'm really energized this week. It's an interesting time to have this conversation because I feel like enough is enough of the last few years of sort of pulling back a bit and figuring out things. Now is the time to hit go again. It's just urgent.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly urgent, and I think that there is a lot speaking to people's anger and pain. And I think a lot of the time, what we fail to recognise is a lot of people's anger and pain is justified. It just doesn't happen to be caused by immigration. Yeah. It happens to be caused by a chronic lack of funding in housing. It happens to be caused by a real lack of an industrial strategy that recognised that the world was changing and that jobs were going to need to change and we need to invest. in making sure that people are fit for the new jobs as the old jobs go. And so communities were ripped away, ripped apart, destroyed. I get the anger. I get the pain. I know it's real. I just know that they're being fed the wrong target for that anger, because that anger is actually at the system makers, the politics, the incredibly wealthy, the industrialists. It's probably capitalism. It's a whole range of things. And I think that really upsets me, because it's just actually going to make things worse. You hit the wrong people and you're never going to solve the problem. If you're actually marching about better housing, you could potentially solve the problem, right? Because that's part of the problem. And so for me, of course, I do have a silver bullet, because you know my background. And for me, that silver bullet is education. And right now, we have a massive investment in this country, billions of pounds wasted on our state mandated education system that is not fit for the 21st century. It is not supporting young people to tell a joyous, celebratory story full of love and compassion about this country, whilst recognising where we came from and the fact that we did things that none of us would put our hands up and say we were proud about, but recognising the advantage that came of that and not being dismissive of it. We have massive advantage for treating people in other countries diabolically. So let's not pretend we didn't do that. But let's also not, let's acknowledge the advantage we've got from it. But equally, teaching young people skills, teaching them how to think, teaching them how to be able to ascertain whether something is a fact or isn't a fact. I would say a massive part of it now is helping young people understand how to navigate the world of social media. An even bigger bit is, what is AI going to do? What does a curriculum that actually facilitates AI look like? For me, the silver bullet is really about transforming education. And I'm not, well, we've just had a pause, haven't we, on the Francis review of education, because some people felt it wasn't radical enough. Some people felt it was tinkering, but it's still delayed. And we just need to do better in education, would be my one global silver bullet, personally. But we didn't come on here to talk about education, but I have to get it in always, partly because I work with young people who've been excluded from that mainstream education, and partly because I can't shut up. But one of the things we did come here to look at very specifically is where you're at now in the Youth Endowment Foundation, and its real drive and mission to look at how it can transform the world for young people, and in particular tackle youth violence. So what do you think is really going on? You're in a position of massive knowledge, because what I read in the paper is that we've got this really violent cohort of young people marauding the streets. They're all carrying knives. I'm not quite sure, actually, that's what the statistics or the facts would say. What's really happening behind the scene with youth violence?
I mean, interestingly, looking at sort of quite zooming out and looking at trends of violence and how much it happens, we've been getting less violent as a society for decades, broadly.
Is that decades going back to the Victorian era, or decades
and
going
centuries
back in
centuries?
Okay.
As in, if you plot, obviously it's difficult to get the data for 500 years ago, but in terms of like, it's sometimes useful, I think, for optimism to really zoom out and look at, and it's the same across the world in lots of societies that have really tried to solve this problem, and I was included that the graph of, like, if depending on what metric you use, but murder per capita is often used, the graph goes down over centuries and decades. The picture over the last sort of 20-30 years is slightly more complicated in terms of what, like, the data suggests. It's still broadly falling, but there are spikes that go up and down. And then specifically over the last decade, which is the time I've been working on this issue and reading about it, writing about it, researching it, it has also gone up and then sort of fallen off slightly with COVID and the different impact. And now we're looking at a situation where it could be turning again. So it kind of like ebbs and flows. Depending on how you measure it. We've now got much more robust ways of measuring that, in terms of the data available from police, in terms of data available from hospital admissions, and also then looking at things like the Youth Endowment Fund do an annual survey of teenagers, This gives us quite a good insight into like how many people are carrying weapons and just how a young person is experiencing the world now. And that suggests that there's still this persistent extreme minority that are carrying weapons and are feeling a certain way, like there always has been. So I think that this, like, it broadly goes down violence over decades. We were able to solve this problem. We're able to do better at it, but over the last decade, it has become a particularly poignant issue. I think part of that is because of the impact of austerity, plainly. I think part of that is the impact of the changing technological landscape we're in. I don't think that actually there's not enough evidence to suggest that social media or the internet has made us more violent. But there is a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of the pre-existing violence that would be happening is now happening also as a result of interactions playing out on the internet, which I think is inevitable. So as in, that is to say, it's transferring online rather than online making it worse. And therefore, the way we understand it's very different. We now, if you're a teenager, you're not just maybe like you would have been 20 years ago. You see someone in your class carrying a knife. You see the police tape at the end of your road. Your friend gets stabbed. Your friend gets dragged in, pulled into a gang to sell drugs, whatever. That might have still been happening. Now you're doing that. Plus, you are scrolling on your phone and you're seeing the fact that there is conflict in Gaza, in Congo, in Asia, you're seeing fairly unfiltered, even to this time, despite the best efforts of governments to campaign on this and tech companies to like pay lip service to it, you're still repeatedly seeing content that is being fed to you that is really violent. So I think that's completely changed. So if you're a teenager now, I just think that like your ability to make sense of violence is a completely different, like, existential process. I just think that's what's really profoundly different for me. And fortunately, I think on the sort of flip side of all of this, I think we are, working in the Youth Endowment Fund allows me to have a national picture of all of these different programs, like Dallaglio Works, for example, of people who are doing great work to try and solve violence and like understanding it from a different sector perspective, from education being, I share your sentiment and your passion for education myself, but also what's happening in prisons, what the police are doing or aren't doing. So I think that, there's lots of things going on. I think that there is a particular situation now as a result of political and technological change. And I think within that technological change, I think that going back to what we were talking about earlier and the potential drivers of things like, 100,000 people marching on London, tech bosses and people who have insane amounts of money that are being funneled into the technology that we are using in the palm of our hand and that teenagers are using in the palm of their hand, they now surely have, if ever there's been a time where we have to start holding business leaders responsible for some of these problems, like when else is it going to be? It has to be now. So I think that's also a massive thing here, the drive of billionaire wealth and technological wealth and how we try and curtail that. Elon Musk was broadcasted the march on Saturday. It's crazy. And that, that's also, he belongs to a cohort of billionaires and extremely wealthy people who are owning tech companies that are, we know this, out designing algorithms that are like pushing content that makes you feel negative. Imagine if you're a 12-year-old, are you trying to deal with that? How do you deal with that unless you take away their phone, which is another conversation. So yeah, those are some thoughts.
To bypass the phone or not to phone, to social media in schools to not, all of that.
I do have interesting thoughts on that though. So we don't have to bypass.
Maybe we will jump back to that. Let's take a park on that. I certainly think your point about, in terms of the violence, the desensitization to it just because of the mass exposure is troubling, because I do think it might not lead to more violence, but it might lead to more violent violence. And the reason I say that is if you look at the pornography industry, which you may also call the exploitation of women, although people get very angry at that. But if you look at the pornography industry, for a very strange reason, I found a Playboy magazine from 1976 when I was sorting through books. When I thought I might sell my house, I've now changed my mind. And in that Playboy magazine, there are images there that you would see before the watershed now. There was nothing there that you wouldn't see every day. They would probably be classified as PG in a film. And that was Playboy. And now 80% of young people before the age of 14 have seen hardcore porn. And so and we now have the highest rate of impotency amongst teenage boys that has ever been recorded. Because in order to get their rocks off, because I cannot think of a better way of putting it, unfortunately, but in order to get their rocks off, they are needing very extreme types of sex and sexual activity, because that's what they've seen on the internet. And therefore, we know that this constant repetition of escalating behaviours fundamentally affects the way that your brain is wired, so it affects you physiologically. And if what you're saying about violence is true, there's a kind of a horrible inevitability that impact on your neurological pathways in your brain could be the same for violence as it has been for pornography and sexual acts. And that's troubling. And I think your point about where does the accountability for this lie? We really have very strict codes about what you can publish in print and mainstream media. And we are fannying about with this third party, we're not responsible for the content. And unless we make the owners of these platforms responsible for the content, I don't think we're ever going to see a change, because they make money out of extremism, whatever that extremism is.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard. And it kind of, I do think that there's something, I've already referred to it. I do think there's something symbolically quite significant and scary about the fact that, for example, on Saturday, the Prime Minister of this country did not address the march, but the richest man in the world, being zoomed in from America, who owns a social media company, was more present at the march. Doesn't that reflect a shift in power, like a real shift in power, genuine? Like, the political systems can't contain this type of financial growth that these tech companies have been able to amass over the last 20 years. I think back to, like, just to use your analogy a bit, of like thinking back to when I was a teenager in the 2000s, and like there was, for example, the happy slap craze, and that was like perceived as quite crazy, where people would like film people being slapped on the street, and there would be videos that would be sent round on Bluetooth. That was the equivalent of something quite crazy, or like maybe at most like a fight. Now, if you're a teenager at school, you can just scroll and see someone getting stabbed, someone getting run down with a Rambo, a woman getting beaten up, whatever.
So then we have to take the point.
Racial violence, so I think that, I basically agree with your idea about like the desensitization point. And I also, just doubling down on saying about who is responsible for that. That growth of tech wealth is not a coincidence. It's completely aligned with a lot of these problems I feel. And I don't know how you contain that level of power. How do we contain that level of power? It's really hard.
It is, and they're not all of them, and that's very unfair, but the current billionaire cadre, a lot of them are not philanthropists. Bill Gates, the exception, is a philanthropist. He does a lot with his money. He's pledged to give it away. Warren Buffett's pledged to give it away. But the cadre of Elon Musk, they're not. They're interested in power for power's sake, and the part of their power package is money. And quite why that man thinks he deserves an opinion on our political system is totally beyond me. In fact, why he deserves to get high on drugs and give me an opinion on anything is beyond me. But I think you segued back very nicely to phones, so we're going to go there. What are you going to do about mobile phones? What are you going to do about them for young people, full stop? What are you going to do about them in schools?
Well, so a lot of my research, writing, and actual youth work has always pivoted around music culture, because I've grown up as a music fan. I'm a music writer. I was doing that alongside my youth work, and I feel like music is often the way I kind of connect with the world. It just is my earliest memories are sort of listening to my dad's vinyls and feeling the bass line and like that. So it's just a very, it's an integral part of who I am. And often because of my interest in particular like subcultures and subgenres of British music, I've been able to use that knowledge and that history in my life of researching, of digging, of listening to underground music as a conversation starter for when I was a youth worker, and often as a way of connecting with teenagers, especially, for example, in South London, when new types of rap are always being innovated. I can sort of be part of that conversation. That's always what I did. And that obviously sits alongside, particularly in the last 10 years, conversations about violent rap music and drill music, because a lot of that music success and a lot of music success generally now is how can you get on people's radars? How can you get on people's phones? How can you game these algorithms? How can you record content that is going to get virality? How is it going to get shared? And I think what drill music in the late 2010s did really well successfully, whether anyone likes it or not, is to game that system. So this tech world that we're talking about, actually a lot of quite traumatized, excluded, mostly young men were able to game that tech system and that algorithm system to get wealth and attention and probably disproportionate influence over like young people because of their music being so successful. So I give all that context because that's how I've like seen the growth of it's often the lens through which I look at the rise of concern about phones and about social media. And it's interesting because I think about, I've been in so many debates here, I've written about it. I've been in so many debates about music and music culture and is the music going too far and whatever. And I often come down quite hard on the side of I think that there's no clear chicken and egg winner of this debate. But I think that quite often when people are angry about the music, I think that they're looking at the wrong source of the problem, because the source of the problem is just in the technology that's allowed that music to spread. And music, obviously, you can encourage, and you can encourage someone not to write a violent lyric, for example, not to threaten someone. That's just like a basic level of decency. But music and culture comes out of the world. Humans are like it emanates from our experience. If our experience is that we're a teenager and we're allowed to do whatever we want on our phone and speak to anyone however we like, and we're trying to get attention, and these tech companies have allowed us that power, then the music's just going to reflect that. So I think that often, basically what I'm saying is that the problem often is for example, with music, but I think a lot of other cultural phenomena recently, the problem ends up being the fact that we have given too much social media tech power to young people who don't know necessarily how to contain their emotions. They don't even know how to they're not legally allowed to have sex even, but they might be able to command millions of views on YouTube because of rapping about stuff they've not even done, because it's really violent and it's threatening people. I think that's a huge amount of power, and I think it's a misstep. So the analogy, the metaphor that I often use to think about this is I think about it like driving a car. I think that we accept now, pretty much everyone, and I think even someone who is rebellious would accept that they should probably wait till they're 17. They should do a theory test. They should have lessons, and then they take their driving test, and then they pass it, and then they get their license, and then they're allowed to drive. And when they drive, they have to follow the rules. You don't just hand a car to a 12-year-old who is not able to drive it properly. They haven't passed their test. They haven't been prepared for it. They're not old enough to deal with road rage, to deal with even look over the counter, they look over the steering wheel. So my point is, I think that we have to be treating these types of tech, types of technologies in a similar way that we treat other types of social norms that we've just got used to, like a car. And I think that that's kind of my conclusion on this. I come down quite hard on the fact that I think increasingly we're moving in this direction anyway, where I think like maybe under 16s, I just think we have to be legislating harder and harder to try and make it safer and safer for young people to be using this type of technology. I reckon I give it a decade before ideas like that's being trialed in Australia right now, where they've said no social media for under 16s. I think those ideas are going to spread more once there's more evidence that they work. My suspicion is that they will, to sort of certainly for mental health outcomes. I suspect that, and even that bleeds into things like attention spans and ability to engage in school and things. So I guess in summary, I'm quite strict about this, but I also recognize the reality of it as well. Like, I think we have to be realistic, but there's also certain things we can do in terms of the law and in terms of trying to create social norms out of these technologies.
I mean, I love your car analogy. And, it's very like children going up chimneys. We don't let them do it anymore. We identify when practices we've had that have been, to be fair, when the car first was invented, everybody drove without a license, nothing to do with children. And over time, we've said this is dangerous. We need to do something about it. And I think there is sufficient evidence to say that the power of what's in your hand with this phone is dangerous if it's unchecked, because I think we are seeing its impact on the damage it does to your neurological pathways. Actually, whether that's 2 and all you're doing is flicking. I mean, I had the privilege, I love it, going to a nursery to have a look at nursery kids. And they were some who had just joined, they were just joining to go into their first year of school, and they were swiping books. They'd never seen a book. They were trying to make it swipe. They were poking it and swiping it and trying to make it work because they've never actually seen a book. Now, I personally think books are a great thing. I'm not saying that books will be here forever, but I am saying that when you're that conditioned that you don't recognise things, then we're in trouble. So I think there is no doubt that you are right, that we don't understand fully the dangers of both the having social media and everything else. And I put into that AI in your hands without actually any checks and balances for very young, very vulnerable people. I'm not as optimistic as you are that we will get a globally accepted ban, and I'm also not as sure that that's the right way to go. And I tell you for why. In very isolated, a lot of people, maybe their personal identity, maybe where they live, the only connectivity they get where they see people like them is through having that kind of connection, through digital connections. And I also think that artificial intelligence will allow us to do something very different very quickly with social media. So rather than a total ban, I think we will be able to develop very good parental controls. I say that in parenthesis because I don't think that's what it will be. That means that we are actually allowing young people to have mobile technology that will help them discern fact from fiction, that will help them understand how technology works in the workplace, will help them solve problems, will help them develop inquiring minds, but will stop them doom scrolling into how to kill myself or how to self-harm better, how to hide my self-harming. And these are the algorithms that pop up all the time. How to indulge in sadomasochistic sex. I mean, this is what kids are looking at, and this is what they will not be able to look at. The way I think we get there is going back to your original point, is the only way you get there is if the people who are publishing this stuff get held accountable for what they publish. And therefore they will introduce the really robust controls. But would I ban it? Probably today I'd have to, because they don't exist. But do I think we will get measures that mean that you get age appropriate content built in through the use of really smart technology? I think that's probably where we'll end up, touch wood, with a fair wind.
Yeah,
but
agreed.
oh dear,
Agreed.
It's a bad world out there right now. So
Yeah.
just let's end on something positive, because I'm aware I've taken a fair chunk of your time, Ciaran. It's been fabulous, and I think we could go again with different topics, because it's been brilliant to talk to you. But let's end on something really positive. Throughout your last decade, and fortunately I'm still doing it, you get to listen to a lot of young people. What are the messages they're giving you? What should policymakers been taken from those young people? We always ask adults to give advice to young people, stuff that I'm not interested. What great advice and wisdom are you picking up from young people today?
I think one thing that I guess I've lived out, that I still see when I speak to young people and part of any sort of like youth voice projects that we do at the Youth Endowment Fund, is this idea of trusted adults, and and I'm glad that that's starting to like gain traction as a sort of policy term. I think there's a good alignment between belief that you need someone there for you, who isn't your parent or even a family member, who isn't an authority figure as well. And again, this goes back to the point about why youth work can be so powerful, because I think they can be trusted adults in a very unique way. But I think trusted adult can manifest in lots of different ways. It could be a rugby coach, it could be a sports coach. It could be, I think about studio engineers, so like music studio engineers. I think for a lot of rappers, for example, who go to the studio to let out their pain and their anger on the mic, the studio engineer who's recording it, that's the trusted adult in there. They can have that conversation with them. They can debrief what's happened. They can warn them about what lyrics they're writing. So I think because of my role as a youth worker and as a trusted adult to a lot of young people over the years, that I've seen that how that can really like be beneficial for them and allow me to feel like I'm participating in society in a meaningful way that is authentic. And I think continually now, when I'm having these conversations, for example, I'm on the expert advisory group for the government's national youth strategy, which is going to be published soon, which let's see what happens about actually what changes. But I can say that an important part of that strategy that's come from asking thousands of young people across the country about what they need, one of the important things was all of them recognize the need for a trusted adult outside of their family, outside of school. So I think that's a really positive way to go, and I'm really with that. I think like if I have to pick one sort of thing that my work at the Youth Endowment Fund has shown me, combined with my own journey as a youth worker, combined with what young people say, I think that's probably it.
That's fantastic. I think mine are many, but what I come out with, and I still hold dear, is that when I'm talking to young people, and not all of them sadly, but when I'm talking to young people, often the best thing in their life is their mates, and the best thing in their life with their mates is a laugh, and an innocent belly laugh, giggle. And we ran a session recently and we were all just in giggles. And I just think in this time of unbelievable misery, where I wake up just thinking about all the things that are not going right and all the things that are going wrong, I hold on to those young people just giggling. And when you hear even very small children laugh, I don't think there's a better sound in the world, the sound of laughter. So thank you for your time. I'm going to take away some laughter, and I am just going to confess to why we're doing Mark 2, because I have laughed in shame ever since. Thank you for doing this again with me, Ciaran. I'm so sorry for the first time we did it. I forgot to record it all together. And let's do another one that we record again. You've been absolutely epic. It's been great talking to you. Thank you for your time.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.